My name is Aidan West. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the kind of person people describe as solid, reliable, technical, steady, not leadership material. I work in Seattle as a senior data analyst for a logistics tech company that most people outside the industry have never heard of, but whose systems quietly move millions of dollars worth of product every week. I don't manage a team. I don't dominate meetings. I don't have the kind of personality that fills a room before I even speak. I listen. And in corporate environments, listening is often mistaken for lacking ambition. If you'd asked my colleagues a year ago who would eventually run a division, my name wouldn't have come up. I was the guy who stayed late to fix forecasting errors, the one who cleaned up reporting inconsistencies before quarterly reviews, the person executives trusted with sensitive numbers, but not with a vision. And I understood why. Leadership, to many people, looks like confidence performed out loud. I've never performed anything. I prefer precision over volume, preparation over persuasion. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontation. No shouting across conference tables, no public humiliation, no cinematic mic drop moment. It's about something quieter. It began the day my boss told me I wasn't leadership material. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it casually, as if stating a neutral fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. 6 weeks later, he asked for my help. And when he did, I didn't remind him what he said. I didn't have to. What happened in between wasn't explosive. It was deliberate, methodical, almost invisible. This is a story about how people assign you a role, and how if you're patient enough, you can step outside of it without announcing that you ever felt confined. It's about silence that isn't weakness, preparation that looks like compliance, and power that doesn't raise its voice. I'm going to tell you exactly what I felt, where I hesitated, and where I almost convinced myself to stay small. No exaggeration, no dramatization, just the truth of how quiet dominance actually works. Have you ever been underestimated so consistently that you almost started believing it yourself? In the office, I was known for two things: accuracy and availability. If a dashboard broke at 9:40 p.m., I fixed it. If a projection model didn't reconcile before a board meeting, I stayed until it did. If someone needed historical data from 3 years ago that no one else could locate, I somehow knew exactly which archived folder to open. People appreciated me, but appreciation isn't the same thing as respect. I wasn't invited into early stage strategy conversations. I wasn't asked what I thought the company should do next quarter. When brainstorming sessions happened, my calendar invite usually read optional. And when I did attend, my contributions were often met with polite nods, the kind that mean thank you for the data, not thank you for the vision. There's a difference. My boss, Daniel Mercer, was the opposite of me in every visible way. Confident, decisive, charismatic in a way that played well in executive rooms. He had the kind of energy that reassured stakeholders even when the numbers were uncertain. And to his credit, he had built the operations team from almost nothing. I respected him, but I could feel the ceiling he had quietly placed above me. In performance reviews, I consistently scored high on execution, exceptional technical skill, dependable under pressure, strong support presence. Support. That word appeared more than once. At first, I told myself that it was fine. Not everyone wants to lead. Not everyone is built for it. I leaned into being indispensable behind the scenes. If I couldn't be visible, I could at least be necessary. But invisibility has a strange side effect. Over time, people stop asking what you want. In meetings, when discussions drifted toward operational redesign or long-term scaling, I would see assumptions forming in real time. Daniel would turn to one of the louder managers and say, "What's your take?" And even when the conversation hinged on metrics I had personally built, I wasn't the first or second voice consulted. I noticed something subtle. When I spoke softly, people leaned in for a moment. When someone else spoke confidently, even without data, heads nodded more quickly. It wasn't malicious, it was human. We mistake volume for certainty. There were moments when I could have interrupted more forcefully, claimed space, repeated my point louder, but that's never been my instinct. I've always believed that clarity outlasts theatrics. The problem is theatrics get remembered faster. Outside of meetings, colleagues would stop by my desk for quick questions. They trusted my judgment one-on-one. They relied on my numbers to defend their own ideas. But in public settings, the narrative shifted. I was the foundation, not the architect. And foundations aren't invited to speak. The strange part is I didn't resent them. Not at first. I understood the role I had drifted into. The steady hand, the quiet fixer, the person who made everyone else look competent because the data was airtight. There's a comfort in that position. It's predictable. You're needed, you're safe from blame because your work is rarely visible enough to attack, but safety can quietly become confinement. I began to sense that the version of me they saw, competent but not visionary, was hardening into something permanent. And the more I delivered flawlessly within that box, the more the box reinforced itself. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was who I was to them, and for a long time I allowed it. The moment itself lasted less than 10 seconds. It happened during a quarterly planning session, one of those extended meetings where leadership debates, resource allocation like it's a chess match, slides, projections, conservative estimates versus aggressive growth models. I'd built 3 separate forecasting scenarios for that meeting: conservative, moderate, expansion heavy. Daniel was presenting. I sat 2 seats to his right, laptop open, ready to answer questions if needed. When the conversation turned to scaling into a secondary distribution region, one of the senior directors asked the question I had already modeled. What's the risk exposure if demand softens by 10% mid-quarter? Daniel hesitated. He glanced at the slide behind him, then back at the director. We've run some numbers, he said, but it's not fully baked yet. I blinked. The model had been finalized the night before. I had sent him the summary at 10:14 p.m. with 3 highlighted risk thresholds and mitigation paths. I waited. He continued, at this stage, I'd rather not overcommit to projections that aren't leadership ready. Leadership ready. The words were casual, almost throwaway. But something about the phrasing lodged in my chest. The director nodded and moved on. The conversation pivoted. The moment passed. No one looked at me. No one asked if the numbers existed. After the meeting, Daniel walked beside me down the hallway. Good work on the prep, he said, not unkindly. But when we present at that level, it has to feel decisive. Sometimes the data is strong, but the framing isn't leadership material. There it was, not accusatory, not harsh, just categorized. I nodded, understood, and I meant it. I truly did. But on the train ride home that evening, I replayed the exchange over and over. Not because I felt angry, because I felt clarified. The model wasn't incomplete. It wasn't weak. It had contingency triggers built into it that most teams wouldn't have considered until too late. What was missing wasn't rigor. It was ownership. Daniel had positioned uncertainty as a strategic choice. And in doing so, he subtly positioned my work as not yet suitable for executive visibility. I asked myself an uncomfortable question. Had I been delivering excellent tools without claiming authorship? For years, I had assumed that good work would naturally rise, that clarity would be recognized, that consistency would translate into credibility. But credibility, I was starting to realize, is partially constructed in public. It isn't enough to be right. You have to be seen as right. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't send a follow-up email clarifying the completeness of the model. I didn't correct the narrative. I saved the moment instead. That's what I do when something matters. I write it down. Not emotionally, factually, date, context, language used. In my black notebook that night, I wrote, leadership ready equals framing, not substance. It wasn't resentment, it was data. And data, when observed carefully, tells you where the leverage actually is. That was the first small cut. Not painful enough to protest, but sharp enough to wake me up. The first time someone underestimates you, it feels accidental. The second time, contextual. By the 5th or 6th time, it becomes culture. After that quarterly meeting, nothing dramatic changed. There was no overt shift in how I was treated, no confrontation, no sudden exclusion. It was subtler than that. During cross-functional syncs, Daniel began summarizing my analysis before I could speak. Not inaccurately, just conclusively. as if my presence was optional because my output could be translated through him. When executives asked about model assumptions, he would say, "The team has run multiple iterations." Instead of, "Aidan built contingency layers into this." The work was still valued. I just wasn't attached to it. At first, I rationalized it. He's protecting the narrative. He wants a single voice in an executive settings. This is how hierarchy works. And to some extent, all of that was true. But something else was happening in parallel. In smaller meetings, colleagues began mirroring the same behavior. They would paraphrase my suggestions and reintroduce them with more assertive language. And when those reframed versions landed well, no one traced the idea back. It wasn't theft, it was dilution, and I participated in it. Every time I stayed quiet instead of clarifying authorship, I reinforced the pattern. Every time I told myself that outcomes mattered more than credit, I made it easier for the room to forget who built the foundation. I noticed the internal dialogue shifting. It's fine, I don't need recognition. It's strategic to stay behind the scenes. Leadership is political. I'm not interested in politics, but the truth was more uncomfortable. I was afraid that if I claimed space and the room didn't validate it, the verdict would become permanent. It's safer to be underestimated by choice than to test your potential and fail publicly. So I normalized it. When Daniel casually described me in a talent calibration session as indispensable, but more of a specialist than a driver, I didn't flinch. When a newer manager was fast-tracked into a visible initiative despite leaning heavily on my models, I congratulated him. When someone joked that I was the brain in the basement, I laughed with them because the alternative would require confrontation, and confrontation disrupts comfort. There's a strange psychology in being quietly competent. People rely on you without feeling threatened by you. They praise you in private and overlook you in public. You become safe, predictable, contained, and the more stable you are, the less urgency anyone feels to elevate you. Why promote the foundation? It's already holding everything up. What I didn't realize at the time was that normalization doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. I started filtering my own thoughts before sharing them. Softening proposals, waiting for explicit invitations, editing my language to avoid sounding overly decisive. I wasn't shrinking dramatically, just incrementally. And incremental shifts are the most dangerous because you barely notice them. By the end of that quarter, I had become exactly what they described, reliable support. Not because I lacked vision, because I had quietly agreed to play the role. There's a moment in every workplace when you realize the script has already been written for you. You don't audition for it, or you don't agree to it. But somehow everyone else knows your lines. Mine became clear during a restructuring discussion. The company was expanding into a new vertical. Higher risk, higher reward. Daniel called a closed-door meeting with senior managers to assign ownership lanes. I wasn't technically required to attend, but I was invited to provide analytical input, which meant stay ready, stay quiet. As responsibilities were distributed, I noticed the pattern. High-visibility initiatives went to the vocal managers. Client-facing pilot programs went to the charismatic ones. Operational firefighting went to the aggressive problem solvers. And infrastructure stabilization, that came to me. Aidan will make sure the back-end modeling stays clean while we experiment, Daniel said. He's our anchor. Anchor. It sounded complimentary. It felt limiting. An anchor holds things steady, doesn't move the ship. I nodded, of course. It was logical. I was good at system stability. I could anticipate failure points weeks in advance. If something was going to break under scale, I usually saw it before it did. But what struck me wasn't the assignment itself. It was the assumption. No one asked whether I wanted to lead one of the pilots. No one considered that I might want to present directly to stakeholders instead of supplying slides to someone else. The role had calcified. Reliable, useful, invisible. And the dangerous part, I had helped shape it. For years, I had optimized quietly. I had delivered without self-promotion. I had allowed Daniel to be the public translator of my work. I thought I was being strategic, but I was also being convenient. There's a difference between humility and self-erasure. One afternoon, while reviewing deployment metrics, I overheard two colleagues talking near the espresso machine. If this expansion fails, at least Aidan will clean up the mess, one of them said, half laughing. Yeah, the other replied, he's built for that. Built for cleanup, not built for command. I didn't feel insulted. I felt categorized. And categories are powerful because they simplify complexity. Once someone assigns you a box, they stop scanning for evidence that contradicts it. I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. I wrote, role assigned, stabilizer, not a decision maker. And beneath that, question, who benefits from this? The answer was obvious. Stability makes risk takers look bold. Quiet competence allows louder personalities to appear visionary. If the ship sails smoothly, the captain gets credit. If it leaks, the anchor gets deployed. The system worked for everyone except the version of me I hadn't tested yet. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. No one was actively holding me back. They were simply responding to the version of me I consistently presented. And if that version never shifted, neither would the ceiling. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday evening, alone in the office, under fluorescent lights that hummed just loud enough to make the silence noticeable. Most of the team had already left. Expansion planning was in full swing, and the new vertical was beginning to show early strain. Demand projections were slightly off. Fulfillment costs were creeping upward. Nothing catastrophic, just small indicators. I was reviewing variance reports when I noticed something subtle. The risk thresholds I had modeled weeks earlier, the ones deemed not leadership ready, were beginning to activate. Not dramatically, not in a way that would set off alarms, but precisely the way I had predicted. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. It wasn't validation that I felt. It was clarity. Knew where the friction points were. I knew where the friction points were. I knew which assumptions were fragile. I knew which teams were overconfident in their buffers. And I realized something that unsettled me. If I stepped back, even slightly, the ripple effects would be immediate. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because no one else had mapped the terrain as completely. For years, I had equated leadership with visibility, with presentation decks, with a persuasive tone. By occupying the head of the table, but sitting there alone, I saw a different definition. Leadership is leverage, and leverage is awareness plus timing. I didn't need to be louder. I needed to be deliberate. That evening, I made a quiet decision. I would stop correcting other people's framing in real time. I would stop volunteering extra clarity that protected their projections. I would continue doing my job precisely, ethically, professionally, but I would no longer overextend to compensate for strategic overconfidence. Not sabotage, not withdrawal, alignment. If someone chose a risky path after being given accurate data, I would document it and let the outcome teach what my words never could. For the first time, my silence felt different. Before, it had been defensive. Now, it was selective. There's a subtle power in knowing you don't have to argue to be right. I closed my laptop that night with an unfamiliar calm. Nothing external had changed. Daniel still believed I wasn't leadership material. My colleagues still saw me as the stabilizer, but internally the frame had shifted. I wasn't invisible. I was observant. An observation, when paired with patience, becomes strategy. On the train ride home, I didn't replay conversations. I didn't rehearse what I should have said weeks earlier. Instead, I asked myself a simpler question. If they already believe I'm only capable of support, what happens when support becomes scarce? That was the first time I understood that dominance doesn't require volume. It requires restraint. After that Tuesday evening, nothing about my workload changed. But everything about my posture did. Silence used to be my default setting. Now it was intentional. In meetings, I answered questions directly. No elaboration beyond what was asked. When projections were debated, I provided the numbers without cushioning the interpretation. If someone leaned toward an aggressive expansion scenario, I outlined the quantified risks once, clearly, and stopped there. Previously, I would have followed up. I would have sent a clarifying email, added a supplemental model, scheduled a quick sync, just to be safe. Now, I didn't. Not out of resentment, out of alignment. If leadership meant making decisions under uncertainty, then leadership also meant owning those decisions. My role was to inform, not insulate. At first, no one noticed. Daniel continued presenting confidently. The expansion initiative rolled forward. Slack channels buzzed with optimism. The louder managers leaned into their pilot programs with visible enthusiasm. From the outside, I looked exactly the same, but internally I was observing reactions more closely. When someone dismissed the conservative projection as overly cautious, I didn't defend it twice. I simply documented the assumption shift in my notebook. When a timeline was compressed to meet an ambitious target, I updated the risk matrix and shared it neutrally. No persuasive tone, no subtle urgency, just data. Something interesting began to happen. Without my habitual overcompensation, small inefficiencies started surfacing more visibly. A delayed shipment here, a margin squeeze there. Nothing dramatic, but no longer quietly absorbed by extra hours or invisible model adjustments. People began asking sharper questions. Didn't we account for this? Yes, I would reply calmly. It's in scenario 2. I never said the one you deprioritized. I didn't need to. Silence, when paired with documentation, creates its own gravity. There's a misconception that dominance requires confrontation. To shift perception, you must challenge authority directly. But direct challenges often trigger defensiveness. Absence, on the other hand, creates contrast. I stopped being the invisible shock absorber, and the system began to feel the texture of its own friction. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk. "You've been quieter lately," he said, almost casually. "I'm focusing on precision," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Good." There was a brief pause. I could sense he felt something slightly different, but couldn't quite name it. The truth was, I wasn't quieter. I was contained. I had stopped trying to earn a label that had already been assigned. Instead, I was gathering something more valuable. Proof. Proof of foresight. Proof of pattern recognition. Proof of decision pathways ignored. Not for confrontation, for timing. And here's the subtle shift that changed everything. I stopped needing them to see my leadership. I started building it anyway, without announcement, without permission, without volume. And when you no longer chase recognition, your posture changes in ways people feel before they understand. They began mistaking my restraint for disengagement. It was calibration. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed what I was doing. From the outside, my days remained predictable. Morning stand-up, model reviews, cross-team syncs. Slack updates were written in the same calm tone I'd always used. But behind that routine, I started building something different. First, I audited everything. Not just the numbers, assumptions, decision trails. Who approved what? When risk thresholds were consciously deprioritized. When timelines were compressed for optics instead of feasibility. I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was mapping patterns. I created a private reference file. Not emotional commentary, just timestamps and context. Expansion decision approved, despite scenario 2 risk flag. Budget reallocated without buffer restoration. Forecast confidence was publicly stated at 92% despite the internal volatility band widening. It wasn't about being right. It was about understanding the system more clearly than anyone else. Then I did something even more important. I stopped solving problems prematurely. When a pilot team requested a revised projection, I delivered exactly what they asked for. No extra scenario modeling unless requested. When a manager asked, "Are we safe here?" I responded with quantified probability ranges instead of reassurance. Previously, I had translated risk into comfort. Now, I translated it into responsibility. In parallel, I began expanding my own knowledge quietly. I enrolled in an advanced operations strategy course online. I reviewed investor communication frameworks. I studied how executive narratives are constructed, not just how data supports them, but how data is framed to influence direction. Leadership wasn't about being louder. It was about controlling context. I also deepened relationships, but selectively. Instead of broad networking, I built credibility with 2 directors outside Daniel's immediate circle. I shared insights without an agenda. I asked questions about long-term scaling challenges. I positioned myself as someone who thought beyond spreadsheets. No announcements, no LinkedIn updates, no visible ambition, just alignment. There's a psychological principle most people overlook. When you consistently deliver without complaint, people assume you always will. So I made a subtle adjustment. I stopped being available instantly. If a non-urgent request came at 8:45 p.m., I responded the next morning. If someone asked for a quick fix, I clarified the scope before agreeing. Nothing dramatic, but enough to shift expectations. Dependable, yes. Unlimited, no. Meanwhile, the expansion initiative began experiencing friction exactly where I had predicted weeks earlier. Cost creep accelerated, margin buffers tightened, vendor performance variability widened beyond tolerance. Still, nothing catastrophic, just enough discomfort to introduce doubt. In meetings, when performance dips were reviewed, I didn't speak first. I waited. Eventually, someone would ask, "Did we anticipate this?" And calmly, I would pull up the slide dated 6 weeks prior. "Yes, it's here." No accusation, no emphasis, just a fact. The room would grow quiet for a second longer than usual. That extra second was new. What they never noticed was that I wasn't trying to win arguments. I was building contrast between confidence and foresight, between optimism and preparation, between visibility and durability. The more friction surfaced, the more valuable stability became. And stability was my territory. But this time, I wasn't offering it freely. I was documenting its scarcity. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel had said I wasn't leadership material. At the time, I interpreted it as a ceiling. Now, I understand it differently. Leadership material isn't declared. It's revealed under pressure, and pressure was beginning to accumulate, quietly. The reveal didn't happen in a meeting. It happened in a spreadsheet. Late on a Thursday afternoon, I was reconciling margin compression across the new vertical when I noticed something subtle but consequential. The operational inefficiencies weren't random. They were compounding. Small timeline compressions were increasing expedited shipping costs. Expedited shipping was distorting projected margins. Distorted margins were triggering reactive discount strategies to maintain volume. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they were forming a loop. And loops, if left unaddressed, don't stabilize. They accelerate. I zoomed out. I rebuilt the projection model, not just to simulate quarterly outcomes, but to simulate leadership behavior. If confidence remained publicly high, mitigation would likely be delayed. If mitigation were delayed, buffers would shrink. If buffers shrank, one moderate external disruption, a supplier delay, a regional demand dip, would tip the vertical into visible underperformance. Not collapse, but enough to demand accountability. I ran 3 scenarios. In every one, the pivot point traced back to the same moment, the early dismissal of conservative modeling in favor of aggressive positioning. 6 weeks earlier, the week I was told my framing wasn't leadership ready, I stared at the output longer than necessary. This wasn't about being right. It was about leverage. For the first time, I understood something fully. I didn't need a title to influence outcomes. I controlled the architecture of foresight. If I chose to step forward strategically, I could stabilize the vertical. I could redesign the buffer structure. I could propose a recalibration plan that would protect margins without public embarrassment. And if I choose not to volunteer for it, the discomfort would continue until someone asked the right question. That was the reveal, not power over people, power over timing. For years, I believed leadership was about being invited into the room, about being endorsed by someone higher, about having authority formally assigned. But what I saw in that spreadsheet was different. Authority emerges where clarity exceeds confidence, and my clarity now exceeded theirs. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because leverage is dangerous when mixed with ego. If I acted out of validation seeking, I would miscalculate. If I framed this as an opportunity to prove Daniel wrong, I would contaminate the precision. So I did nothing. I closed the file. I updated my documentation, and I waited. The following week, the first visible tremor surfaced. A performance dashboard flagged variance outside tolerance for 2 consecutive reporting cycles. Not catastrophic, but no longer ignorable. In the leadership sync, Daniel's tone shifted slightly. Still confident, slightly more measured. "We're seeing short-term compression," he said. "We'll stabilize." I didn't interrupt. Then came the question I had anticipated. "Did we miss anything early on?" one of the directors asked. Daniel hesitated, and for the first time in months, he looked at me before answering. It wasn't a long look, just long enough. In that moment, I understood the entire dynamic had changed. He didn't see me as the anchor anymore. He saw me as the archive, the one who remembered, the one who mapped risk before it became visible. I haven't spoken yet, because the reveal wasn't public. It was internal, I knew. And now, he suspected, that was enough. There's a quiet crossroads that doesn't look like one. No dramatic music, no visible fork in the road. Just a choice that determines how the next chapter unfolds. By the time the third variance report surfaced, the room felt different. Not tense, not panicked, but no longer certain. Confidence had softened into caution. And that's when the options became clear to me. I could continue exactly as I had been, precise, contained, observant. Let the discomfort expand until someone formally asked me to redesign the mitigation structure. That path would preserve my emotional distance. It would validate my foresight without requiring initiative. Or I could step forward voluntarily, not aggressively, not performatively, but deliberately. The first option was safe. The second was irreversible. Because once you demonstrate leadership under pressure, the narrative shifts permanently. You are no longer supported, you are precedent. I went home that evening and opened my notebook. For weeks I had been documenting patterns without attaching intention to them. But that night I wrote something different. Waiting proves foresight. Acting proves ownership. The difference mattered. If I waited to be asked, I would still be responding within the role they assigned me. If I acted without invitation, I would redefine the role. But redefining a role carries risk. What if my recalibration plan failed? What if the directors saw it as overreach? What if Daniel interpreted it as quite insubordinate? Leadership isn't just clarity, it's exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable when you've spent years being invisible. I asked myself a harder question. What outcome do I want? Recognition? No. Title? Not primarily. Revenge? Absolutely not. What I wanted was alignment between capability and responsibility. I didn't want to keep stabilizing a ship whose direction I had no influence over. If I were going to carry structural weight, I needed to help steer. So I chose the irreversible path. The next morning, before the weekly executive sync, I drafted a concise 3-page recalibration proposal. No emotional framing, no mention of prior warnings, just a clear restructuring of buffer thresholds, vendor renegotiation timelines, and phased scaling adjustments. At the top, I wrote, proactive margin stabilization framework, draft. Not reactive, not corrective, proactive. I sent it directly to Daniel an hour before the meeting with a short message. I thought this might be helpful context before today's review. No commentary, no positioning. Then I closed my laptop and waited. This was the first time I wasn't reacting to events. I was shaping them. Whether he used it or not, something had already shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking to be seen. I was offering direction. And once you do that, you can't go back to being just the anchor. Daniel didn't respond to my message immediately. He read it though. I could see the timestamp. The executive sync began at 10 a.m. I joined 5 minutes early, camera off, notebook open. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I expected nerves. Instead, I felt settled. When Daniel began the review, his tone was measured. Controlled, he walked through the variance trends, acknowledged the compression, and outlined short-term containment steps. Then something changed. I want to propose a proactive stabilization framework, he said. We've drafted a phased recalibration plan that addresses buffer thresholds and vendor renegotiation pacing. He was using my document, not crediting it directly, not erasing it either, just integrating it seamlessly into his narrative. And here's the part that mattered. I didn't care, because as he moved through the slides that were structurally identical to my proposal, the room responded differently than it had weeks earlier. The directors leaned in. Questions were sharper but less skeptical. The framework was clear. The contingencies were built in. The pacing felt responsible without sounding defensive. At one point, a director asked, when did we start modeling this adjustment? There was a brief pause. Daniel glanced at me. Aidan's team had outlined risk trigger thresholds earlier in the cycle, he said carefully. This builds on that groundwork. It wasn't a full acknowledgement, but it wasn't dismissal. And that distinction was new. The plan was approved for phased implementation. No applause, no dramatic shift, just a subtle realignment of authority. After the meeting, Daniel called me into his office. He closed the door gently. That was strong work, he said. You've been thinking ahead. I try to, I replied. He studied me for a moment, as if recalibrating his internal map. You could have pushed harder earlier, he added. I met his gaze calmly. I presented the scenarios. It wasn't confrontational, it was factual. Another pause. I need you closer to these conversations, he said. More direct. There it was, not a promotion, not an apology, but proximity. And proximity is power. Over the next 2 weeks, the recalibration framework rolled out quietly. Vendor contracts were renegotiated with less urgency, but better terms. Scaling pace adjusted, margin volatility narrowed. Nothing about the company culture transformed overnight. But something about my positioning did. I was looped into earlier strategy calls, asked for interpretation instead of just data, invited to draft executive-facing summaries instead of merely supplying numbers. Still no grand announcement, still no title change, just influence increases through utility. And I never once mentioned what he had said 6 weeks earlier, because the proof didn't require it. The system was stabilizing. But more importantly, the narrative was shifting, not because I demanded it, because I demonstrated it. And when dominance is quiet, it feels less like conquest and more like gravity. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as awareness. Once the stabilization framework began narrowing volatility, something subtle happened across the leadership team. People started asking different questions. Not how fast can we grow, but what are we not seeing yet? That shift seems small. It isn't. When urgency dominates, optimism leads. When uncertainty surfaces, foresight becomes currency. The managers who had leaned heavily into aggressive scaling began adjusting their tone. Not dramatically, just slightly less declarative, slightly more cautious. And in meetings, when risk surfaced, eyes moved toward me without prompting. Not because I was louder, because I had been right without theatrics. There's a psychological ripple when someone quietly proves durable judgment. It doesn't create admiration first. It creates recalibration. Colleagues who once paraphrased my ideas began referencing them directly. Like Aidan mentioned last cycle, we should probably run this through Aidan's scenario lens. It wasn't flattery, it was risk mitigation. And Daniel, this is the part that mattered most, started delegating differently. Instead of summarizing my work for executives, he began inviting me to walk through it myself. The first time he did, it was almost casual. Aidan, do you want to take this one? A small sentence, a significant shift. I didn't overperform. I didn't expand beyond the framework. I spoke clearly, concisely, and stopped when I was done. No rhetorical flourish, just clarity. Afterward, one of the directors sent a brief message. Appreciate the foresight on buffer layering. That was well structured. Again, no applause, just credibility accumulating. But consequences aren't only professional, they're emotional. I noticed something unexpected in myself. Relief. Not because I had proven someone wrong, but because I no longer felt misaligned. The tension of being capable yet categorized had eased. And interestingly, the room felt slightly less comfortable around me. Not hostile, just aware. When someone moves from background to influence without announcement, it disrupts the established hierarchy. No one says it out loud, but dynamics shift. I was no longer the default stabilizer. I was becoming a reference point. And here's the quiet truth about that transition. It creates distance. Some colleagues who once leaned casually on my availability became more formal. Conversations felt more deliberate. Jokes about being the brain in the basement disappeared. Respect had replaced familiarity. Respect is colder than friendliness, but it's steadier. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation outside the conference room. We should loop Aidan in earlier next time, someone said. Earlier. Not after decisions, not for cleanup. Earlier. That was the real consequence. The system had adapted. An adaptation means acknowledgement. Still, I never revisited the sentence that started all of this. I didn't need to, because the environment was now responding to a different version of me. One I hadn't argued into existence. One I had built quietly. The irony is this. By the time people realize they've misjudged you, the dynamic has already changed in ways they can't fully reverse. The expansion vertical stabilized, but not without visible bruises. The early overconfidence left fingerprints. Margins recovered, but growth targets were revised. Forecast language in investor updates became more cautious. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to alter perception. In a quarterly executive review, one of the board advisors asked a pointed question. What internal signals did we miss early on? The room was quiet. Daniel answered carefully, outlining how volatility bands had widened sooner than expected. He acknowledged recalibration efforts. He referenced strong analytical groundwork that had enabled fast course correction. Again, me, without naming me fully. But this time, something else happened. A director spoke up. To be fair, Aidan flagged those thresholds early. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was factual. And facts, when spoken calmly, land heavier than emotion ever could. Daniel didn't argue. He nodded. Yes, that's true. In that moment, there was no embarrassment, no defensiveness, just recognition. After the meeting, Daniel asked me to stay behind. The room emptied slowly, chairs sliding back, muted conversations drifting into the hallway. When the door closed, he didn't sit down immediately. I should have pulled you in sooner, he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a recalculation. I studied his tone. There was no ego in it, just assessment. I presented what I had, I replied evenly. Another pause. I misread your ceiling, he admitted quietly. There it was, not worded exactly the way it had been 6 weeks earlier. Not a direct reference to leadership material, but close enough. And here's the part most people expect to be dramatic. It wasn't. There was no surge of validation, no internal speech prepared, no desire to revisit the original comment, because by then the power imbalance had already corrected itself. Recognition offered late carries less weight than recognition earned under pressure. He couldn't fix the original misjudgment. He couldn't rewind perception. The narrative had shifted organically, not through endorsement, but through outcome. And that shift was irreversible. Over the next few days, I was formally invited to co-lead strategic modeling for the next expansion phase. Not support. Co-lead. Title unchanged. Influence expanded. That's how it happens in real organizations. Not with promotions announced overnight, but with responsibility redistributed quietly. Daniel began asking for my perspective before finalizing decisions. Not because he felt guilty, because he had recalibrated his risk assessment. And once someone recalibrates their risk assessment around you, they don't easily revert. It was too late to fix the initial label, because the label no longer fits, and no one needed to say that out loud. The real confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Daniel asked if I had a few minutes. His tone was neutral, professional, the kind of tone that signals conversation, not conflict. I stepped into his office and closed the door behind me. He didn't sit behind his desk this time. He took the chair across from mine. I've been thinking about something, he began, about how I've positioned you over the past year. There was no tension in the room, just reflection. I waited. I focused on your execution, he continued, your reliability. I think I underestimated how much strategic framing you were already doing. Underestimated, a softer word than what he'd said weeks earlier. But the meaning aligned. I nodded slightly. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. I should have challenged you more publicly, he added, not shielded you behind the work. That part was interesting. Shielded. From his perspective, he hadn't been limiting me. He thought he was protecting narrative clarity, centralizing voice, managing optics. And he wasn't wrong. He just hadn't accounted for growth. I didn't need shielding, I said calmly. I needed exposure. The sentence wasn't sharp. It wasn't emotional. It was measured. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I see that now. There it was again. Recognition without drama. Silence filled the space. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Most people in that moment would revisit the original comment. They'd remind him. They'd reference the exact phrase. Not leadership material. I didn't, because the purpose of this conversation wasn't correction. It was alignment. What do you want moving forward? He asked. Not what title, not what compensation. What do you want? That question carried more weight than any apology could. I want to shape decisions before they're finalized, I replied. Not just optimize them after. Direct. Clear. He nodded. That's fair. And just like that, the confrontation ended. No raised voices, no emotional release, no rehashing the past. Just recalibration. As I stood to leave, he added something almost casually. You handled this well. I didn't ask what he meant, but I knew. I hadn't forced recognition. I hadn't demanded validation. I hadn't tried to prove him wrong. I had demonstrated durability, and durability doesn't argue. It accumulates. When I walked back to my desk, nothing outwardly looked different. Same office, same screens, same background noise of keyboards and quiet conversations. But internally, the hierarchy had shifted. Not because he conceded, because he recalculated. And recalculation in leadership is respect. I still didn't remind him of what he had said 6 weeks earlier. I didn't have to. The version of me that walked into that office 6 weeks earlier would have felt smaller, not visibly, not in posture, but internally. He would have replayed the sentence. He would have questioned his ceiling. He would have wondered if perhaps quiet competence really did disqualify him from influence. That version of me isn't gone. He's just integrated. Because the truth is, I was never not leadership material. I was leadership material that hadn't been stress tested in public. There's a difference. Today, my title hasn't dramatically changed. I'm still officially a senior data analyst, but I co-lead strategic modeling sessions. I'm included before decisions harden. I present directly to stakeholders without translation. And more importantly, I don't shrink before speaking. Not louder, just clearer. The biggest shift isn't external, it's internal. I no longer equate humility with invisibility. I no longer confuse patience with passivity. And I no longer wait for endorsement to validate capability. Leadership, I've learned, isn't about occupying the head of the table. It's about shaping the table before the meeting begins. The younger managers now ask for my perspective earlier. Some of them assume I've always been positioned this way. They don't see the recalibration. And that's fine, because dominance, when it's quiet, doesn't announce itself. It stabilizes rooms without theatrics. Daniel and I work differently now. There's less translation, more direct exchange. He challenges me openly in meetings. I challenge assumptions without hesitation. There's mutuality, not superiority. And here's something I didn't expect. I don't feel vindicated. I feel aligned. Vindication requires someone to lose. Alignment requires everyone to adjust. I didn't climb over anyone. I didn't expose mistakes. I didn't orchestrate failure. I simply stopped overcompensating for misalignment and let reality clarify what words couldn't. The worn black notebook still sits beside my keyboard. I still document assumptions. I still model risk conservatively. I still believe that foresight is a form of respect. But now, when I enter a room, I don't ask myself whether I belong in the conversation. I ask whether the conversation is complete without my perspective. That's a very different posture, and it doesn't require volume. It requires self-trust. The ceiling that once felt solid now feels irrelevant because I stopped measuring myself against it. 6 weeks, that's all it took. Not for revenge, not for promotion, not for public redemption, just for clarity to meet pressure. When my boss said I wasn't leadership material, he wasn't trying to diminish me. He was labeling what he had observed. And what he had observed was a version of me that delivered flawlessly, but never claimed authorship of direction. The mistake wasn't entirely his. It was shared. I had equated silence with strategy. I had mistaken being indispensable for being influential. I had normalized invisibility because it felt safe. What changed wasn't my skill set. It was my posture. I stopped cushioning risk. I stopped absorbing friction prematurely. I stopped waiting to be invited into rooms I was already shaping indirectly. And when the moment came, when the pressure surfaced, I didn't argue for recognition. I demonstrated alignment. 6 weeks later, he asked for my help. I didn't remind him of what he said. I didn't have to, because when someone recalibrates how they see you, the past comment dissolves on its own. Quiet dominance isn't about proving people wrong. It's about becoming undeniable without becoming dramatic. It's about knowing that timing often speaks louder than confrontation. And it's about understanding that leadership isn't declared in performance reviews. It's revealed in pressure cycles. If you're being underestimated right now, ask yourself something simple. Are you staying silent out of fear or out of strategy? There's a difference, and the answer determines everything that follows. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been labeled in a way that felt limiting? And what shifted the narrative for you? Let's talk in the comments.